Hi there, and welcome to a new video on the Sugaridoo channel and a new video in a 1-2-3 quilt along. Today we are going to assemble our quilt top. So over the past 8 weeks we have been sewing our trees, and now it's time to assemble them in a quilt top and turn that quilt top into a quilt sandwich so that we are all set to start quilting our quilt. So in this video we're going to cut strips for the blocks. I'm going to give you some tips and ideas on what to do if your blocks turned out a different size. And after that I'm going to spray baste my quilt and talk a little bit about other options for basting, and then we are all set. So that's what's going to happen in this video. I'm going to clear out my design wheel and then we're ready to get started. I have the layout of the quilt here on my phone, and I'm going to assemble the pink and orange blocks. So just going to check where the blocks are going to go. Let's start with the one in the top left, which is the first flint tree. Here it is, a yellow one. And the final one. So there we go, all the trees are now on the wall, and we need to sew strips in between. So we are going to make 1.5 inch strips in between over here. That is 1.5 finished, so we need to cut strips of 2 inches for here, and then on the horizontal we're going to add sashing of 2 inches wide, so we will cut 2.5 inches for that. All the exact measurements are also on the Bernina blog, so if you want to read the details you can hop over there. The thing I wanted to share about the sizes of the tree blocks is that sometimes when you're sewing something doesn't turn out the size that you actually want. So for example, we have a seam over here. When you don't have that 1/4 inch, then your block can get bigger or smaller. And well, over here we have a seam over here and over here, so it can turn out a little bit bigger or smaller, or maybe when you've printed some of the blocks without checking the size of the little square. But there's no need to worry when something like that happens, or when some of your blocks are smaller. So just a general explanation: when your blocks turn out a little bit narrower than they're supposed to, that's no problem at all, because in each row we have the same trees. So let's say that all my Tess and June blocks are not as wide as they should be, so maybe they're 1 inch smaller. Same height but 1 inch smaller. That's no problem, because then this row will have 1 inch short, this row will have 1 inch short, this row and this row as well. So that happens in all the rows, so no problem at all. When all your blocks are the same height, then you probably can just put your quilt together, no problem. When some of the blocks are shorter than they're supposed to, then you will see a difference. So for example, when this block would be smaller than the rest of the blocks, then you will have a kind of a gap in your row. What I would suggest you to do then is measure how much smaller it is. So let's say this one is 1 inch shorter than it should be, then you will have a gap. When it's 1/8 of an inch, I think don't worry, just wiggle that in your seam allowance, because seam allowance is 1/4 of an inch. So when it's just 1/8 of an inch short, there's no need to worry, I think. But when it's more than that, you can measure it. So this should be 15.5 inch high, including seam allowance. So when, for example, you measure that it's 14.5 inch, you will need to add a strip. I would say do it at the top, just a strip of a background fabric, so that you will make your block 15.5 inches high again. When you would add that strip to the bottom, then the tree trunks would vary a little bit, and I think that would show more than when you would add a strip at the top, because these two also have white space above them, so it's no problem to add some white space to some of the trees if you need to make those blocks bigger. Yeah, so I think that's about what to do when your blocks are not the size that they should be. Yeah, and then we can start adding strips. So for these trees, they are all 15.5 inches high, unfinished, so including seam allowance. So we need a strip of 15.5 inch high and 2 inches wide, and we need 3 strips for each row, so that is 12 strips in total. Let's cut some strips. The first video, or the first pattern, I ask you to set aside 40 inches of fabric to be able to cut the strips at this point in our quilt along. And we're going to start with cutting the strips of 15.5 inch. So I'm just going to line up my fabric with a line on this side, and I've already squared up my fabric. So this is a straight line, so a straight angle with the fold in the fabric. Then when it's lined up nicely on my mat, I can use the measurements on here, because what I want to do is cut off a piece of 15.5 inch. If your blocks turned out a different height than 15.5 inch, you might want to alter the cutting over here. So I'm cutting 15.5 inch because that's the height of my blocks. There we go. So this is 15.5 inch. Let's square this up. So I'm lining up the lines of my ruler with the sides of the fabric, and then trim off the selvedge edge. And now I can start cutting strips of 2 inches wide, because we want 1.5 inch finished. That's 2 strips because the fabric is folded double, and we need in total 12 strips. There we go. That is 12 strips of 2 inches wide and 15.5 inches long. So now we're cutting strips of 2.5 inches from the remaining fabric, because we want strips of 2 inches wide as a sashing between the rows, and also a border of 2 inches all around the quilt. We're going to sew these strips together because one of this strip is not completely long enough to go as a sashing between the rows. Let's start by adding our first strip. So go ahead and add those strips in between all your blocks. So all the rows of the quilt are now done, and I quickly measured the width of my rows to see if they are all the same width, and they all measure up 50 inches. So I am going to make my strips that go in between, so the session to be 50 inches. For that we're going to use that 2.5 inch strips that we cut, and those strips are not long enough to go in between. So this strip is about 44 inches. So first of all, I am going to sew together all these strips and then cut them into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces of 50 inch long. And maybe that 50 inch is a little bit different for you. It depends on the width of your strip that you put in between, and depends on the seam allowance that you're sewing with. So mine turned out 50 inches, but you might want to measure your rows first before you start cutting. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 strips of 50 inches. Now we have sewn and pressed our strips, it's time to cut them. And I'll do that by folding them in half. So I'll put my bunch on that side, and I will fold my strip in half, having the fold on 0 inches and the end on 25. And then I can cut it, so that will give me a 50 inch strip. Place my ruler on a 25 inch mark and then cut it off, and that will give me a 50 inch strip. Now we have all the sashing for in between the rows, and then it's just time to pin them and sew them to the rows. Let's start with the top one. When you put your strip down, just make sure to look at where your seam is, that you have it right sides together. And then I like to pin at one end, then pin at the other end, then fold it in half, wiggle a little bit, and then I'll put a pin in the center. Let's see, I think I can already lay it flat. Yeah, and then just stick a few extra pins in there so it will stay nice in place. Ta-da! So that is the quilt top almost finished. All the sashing is in between the rows, but now we need to add the strips on the sides. So we use the remaining 2.5 inch strips for that. And for this also go ahead and just measure the height of your quilt. And to prevent some wobbling bubbles in the border, you can measure it at both sides and in the middle, and then take that as the length of the outside border. On this side it's 17.5, a little bit less than 17.5. So for me that quilt measures 71 inches. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 strips of 71 inches and sew it to the sides. So the whole quilt top is finished, including the border on the sides. So now it's time to baste our quilt. And basting means that we're going to put 3 layers of the quilt together. So we have the quilt top, then we have a batting. I'm going to use a bamboo batting that I also have in my web shop, already cut to size for this quilt along. And then we will have the quilt backing. There is a backing kit available, but you can also piece some fabric together to get the size of the quilt for the back. And for the batting and the backing, you want to go a little bit wider and a little bit bigger than the quilt top, basically. So yeah, so that is our quilt sandwich. So you have the top, batting and the backing, and we need to put those together. There are different methods to do that, and my preferred method is to use basting spray. So I will demonstrate for you in this video how I do that. But there are also other methods. You can use basting pins, so safety pins with a little kind of dent in it, so they go easily through all layers. And then you put pins through the whole quilt and you will remove those while you're quilting. Some other method is doing with a super large stitch and use that as the basting of your quilt. So you kind of sew your quilting quilt sandwich together with a big stitch, and you can remove that thread later on. You can also, if you have a long arm machine, I'm not sure if all long arm machines are able to do that, but on the Q16, so the Bernina long arm machines, you can also do a basting stitch, and you can set the spacing of the stitch, for example, to 1 inch, and then it will put a stitch every inch through the quilt, so then you can use the machine to baste the quilt. Yeah, so those are a few methods that you can use for basting, and I will show you quickly how I do it with spray basting. So there we go. Let's start by putting the batting on the floor. And then I'll go ahead and put the backing fabric. I'm using a pink solid backing for this. Putting this backing fabric over the batting. There we go. Well, that looks just fine. It's flat enough. So now I'm going to go ahead and use my basting spray to spray baste. Pulling back a little bit of the backing. Well, actually halfway. And then I'll start spraying. And then I do the same thing, but then with my quilt top. So that looks quite good, I guess. I'm going to go ahead and trim the edges a little bit, and then the quilt top is done and basted and ready to be quilted. In the next video we're making a start with quilting our quilt. I'm super excited for that part of the quilt along, and hope to see you there.